Thank you. As a follow-up question, so your conception of truth, as you said, is tailored to what helps us survive and live. Doesn't that also mean that your approach to the meaning of truth is very similar to one of a postmodernist, which are a group of people you so clearly denounce?
That's a good question. It's wrong, but it's a good question. Well, look, you always have to give the devil his due. And there's a central postmodern claim which arises from a very complex conundrum. And the conundrum is one that emerged in domains outside of the humanities, let's say. Although it emerged in the domain of literary criticism, because what happened in the mid-60s was that a very large number of disciplines simultaneously realized that it was actually technically impossible to perceive the world because there was an infinite number of ways that you could perceive the world. And so that bedeviled artificial intelligence. I mean, people thought for a long time that it would be easy to build machines that could see the world because there was the world and there were the objects, and figuring out what the objects were wasn't hard. It was maneuvering in the world that was hard. But that turned out to be wrong. It's really, really hard to figure out what the objects are, and we actually don't know how we do it. Now, 50 years later, we have machines that can orient themselves pretty decently in the world, but they really had to be built in embodied form, and I won't pursue that. At the same time, psychologists who were working on perception ran into exactly the same conundrum because they figured out that they couldn't figure out how we could see things. And we're still sorting that out. And the literary critics figured out that there was no obvious canonical interpretation for a piece of literature. And that raised a specter, which was, well, if there's no obvious canonical interpretation, how do you know that one interpretation is better than the other? So out of that arose the postmodern notion that there's no grand narrative. There's no justifiable grand narrative. There's an infinite number of ways of interpreting the world, and there's no grand narrative. And fair enough. But, well, that raises the problem of value. Like, if there's no grand narrative, how do you orient yourself in the world? And the postmodern answer to that was, well, let's forget about the complexity of that problem and sneak our closet Marxism back into the game. And that was completely intellectually, I've been accused of failing to notice that there's a contradiction between postmodernism and Marxism. It's not like I failed to notice that. It's obvious that there's a contradiction, but it's equally obvious that the postmodernists, broadly speaking, is a thumbnail sketch, because they can't solve the problem of how to orient yourself in the world if there's an infinite number of interpretations, rely in a completely incomprehensible and paradoxical manner on the dictates of like a defunct 19th century philosophy to provide them with motive force in the world. So, and that's a non-tenable solution apart from being dangerous beyond belief, as the 20th century bears sufficient evidence to. So now, with regards to my conception of truth and whether it's postmodern, it's like, no, actually, it's not. So, and it's a very complicated thing to sort out, because there is more than one way of conceptualizing truth. There's truth as it's manifested in ethics, and there's truth as it's manifested in the description, let's say, of the objective material world, and how those two things touch is not something we've sorted out well. In the ethical world, what's happened is that an ethic has evolved over time, I would say, and that ethic is reflected in the central axioms of civilized human behavior, but you can also see deep echoes of it in animal behavior. And it seems to arise out of the fact that the interactions that take place among paired entities that have to interact repeatedly across time follow a set pattern. So one of the things that Jaak Panksepp discovered, for example, was that if you paired rats together to engage in rough and tumble play bouts, which you might not think is particularly relevant, but actually happens to be dead relevant because that's a special circuitry and it's part of the circuitry upon which human ethics are based. If you pair them together first and one rat is bigger than the other, then the big rat wins. And so you think, well, play is dominated by power and that's how it works in rats and it's a power issue. But if you pair them together repeatedly, which is a much more naturalistic experiment, what you find is that once the large rat dominates the small rat has to ask the large rat to play. And if the large rat doesn't let the small rat win 30% of the time in repeated play bouts, then the small rat won't play anymore. And you think, well, so what? It's like, no, not so what. That's a major discovery. That's like Nobel Prize winning material. Because what Panksepp demonstrated there was that there's a an ethic of fair play emerges even among rats. All you have to do is pair them together. And there are rules that govern iterated ethical interactions that are emergent properties. And those emergent properties are manifested, as far as I can tell, described in the great mythological stories that we tell, in the great narratives that underlie our culture. And they're not based on arbitrary assumptions. They're based on observations of what furthered survival and reproduction, to speak in a purely Darwinian manner, over massive spans of time. And to point to truth as construed in a Darwinian realm, and to use the example of, say, iterated games to buttress that point, is by no means similar in any way to participating in the same process that the deconstructionists participate in. So I would say, well, on the side of the postmodernists, but not only the postmodernists, there are an indefinite number of ways of construing the world. That's being demonstrated technically. I don't think there's any debate about that. But there's a very constrained number of ways that you can operate successfully in the world. A very constrained number of ways. And it's not one way precisely, because it has its scope of variation, say, across culture and across environments, but it's very tightly constrained. Now, what's happened across the course of recorded history, let's say, is that ethic, this is something Nietzsche observed when he was critiquing the history of Western philosophy, is that ethic manifested itself first at the level of behavior. We act it out. We don't understand it. Just like a chimpanzee troop acts out the ethic of their hierarchy. They can't represent it. They can't articulate it. The structure emerges. The structure and the behaviors that are associated with the structure emerge before that is represented, and certainly before it's articulated. So first of all, the ethic that governs repeated interactions at different scales of social interaction, the structure emerges first, and then it's mapped. And it's first mapped in image and story, and then it's articulated. And I would say, well, I talked earlier about the role that England has played, that the UK has played in articulating the political doctrine of the sovereign individual. But the idea of the sovereign individual is far older than those political articulations. And it's based in a narrative structure that is in turn based on the observation of behavioral patterns that have emerged reliably across time. And that's not postmodern in the least. It's a very straightforward claim that there is something that approximates a universal human ethic that's built deeply into our biological and social structures, and that was constructed in no small part as a consequence of Darwinian mechanisms. So,
thank you.